Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to keep trying to concurrently tell the story of the American Revolution and the War for Independence without getting them too mixed up. So here are your objectives. Okay, take a moment, write them down, focus, and now let's move forward. So, the American Revolution is the movement to create a new American state, whereas the War for Independence is the battle for independence against England. These two things are connected, but it's important to note that they are not the same thing. And even after independence, the American Revolution is going to continue. So, who are the forces in this American Revolution? The colonists broke down to be about a third, a third, a third, with a third supporting the independence, a third being loyal to Great Britain, and a third wanting to be left alone without having their house burned down and their cows stolen and their fields destroyed by rampaging armies. Only one of these thirds is going to get what they want. So let's talk about how the Patriots won the battle of public opinion over the Loyalists, and how the group that wanted to be left alone was not left alone. A lot of public pressure was used against loyalists, who were known as Tories at the time, because that's the conservative faction in the British Parliament. And they were generally tarred, feathered, boycotted against, protested against, and harassed in order to take control of the public spaces for the independence movement. And so, although there were still some loyalists there, usually at that point they were in hiding. The committees of correspondence and the Continental Organization had persecuted the loyalists strongly enough that most of the local governments, at least the ones that were not occupied by British soldiers, were in the hands of the Patriots. One of the things that turned especially the South against Great Britain was Dunmore's Proclamation, which, apologies for the racist cartoon, but it was used at the time, was the idea that the governor of Virginia offered freedom to any slave who would run away from their master and fight for the British. So a number of slaves did this, and at the end of the war, at least 1,000 slaves were able to escape up to Canada, and some went back to Great Britain, having won their freedom, fighting against independence, which, again, is one of the ironies of the independence movement, which hopefully we will have discussed significantly in class. But the effect of Dunmore's proclamation was to take Southerners who were on the fence about independence and turn them against the British. And so this was a factor in many of the Southern states joining the independence movement. Another factor in the growth of the independence movement was the pamphlet Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Hopefully, we've read sections of it in class, but it laid out the case for independence in plain language, talking about how it's irrational that a child, the United States, should rely on its mother forever, and eventually they need to grow up and grow apart. And the idea that we don't need England for trade, and he just goes on, lays out a whole series of arguments, in the end attacking the idea of monarchy itself. So, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, widely read and important for the independence movement. And committees of safety were important for the independence movement. These were sort of local shadow governments, which recruited people into both the militia and then eventually the regular army. They collected supplies, and they harassed loyalists in order to make sure that they didn't interfere with the war effort. So these worked as sort of shadow governments, often with women taking important leadership roles in order to assure that the revolution could go on, and the revolution and the war for independence could continue uninhibited. Here we see them tarring and feathering a loyalist, which, tarring and feathering seems like it'd be a hilarious thing, but the combination of boiling hot tar, giving you second-degree burns, and then covering you with feathers, it's more of a writhing and agony thing, not a ha-ha, you're a chicken thing. So pretty brutal, actually. The Second Continental Congress was a meeting of all 13 colonies now, in response to the fact that war had now broken out in Massachusetts. And so they needed to figure out what the heck they were doing with this war in Massachusetts. This is, of course, the famous one with all the founding fathers there. George Washington walks in with his wearing his full dress uniform, and you've got Franklin and Adams and Madison and Jefferson and all those guys. And they do offer a last attempt to reconcile with England, something called the Olive Branch Petition, which tried to restore harmony and find a peaceful settlement. But the king refused to even open the Olive Branch Petition, and it's unlikely that they would have been able to come to terms anyway, which pushed us towards the Declaration of Independence. Independence was declared, of course, on July 4th or, July 6th or, July 3rd when it was originally published. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We've decided that it occurs on July 4th. And it declares independence from England, listing a whole list of grievances that the British perpetrated against the colonies. It was written, of course, by Thomas Jefferson, and it's a excellent piece of American civic scripture that hopefully you've read at some point, and if not, you should absolutely go and read it. It's important. So, the Second Continental Congress also created the Continental Army, which is important because if the war was going to be fought by just local militias, it's very difficult to get like a Virginia local militia to march up to Boston and to liberate the city or to help out in New York. So the founding fathers decided that they needed a regular army. And so they created this regular army and started trying to find money to recruit and equip these troops. And they chose George Washington, the hero of the Battle of Fort Necessity, or the survivor of the Battle of. Anyway, George Washington becomes the commander in chief of the Continental Army because he looked the part and because he was someone that all the colonies could agree upon because of his stature and his level-headed judgment and just his in general gravitas. I mean, he's a relatively impressive guy. And so Washington becomes the commander of this new Continental Army, and they're going to head north to try to figure out what the heck to do with Boston. The Second Continental Congress also sets up a committee to start drafting the Articles of Confederation, which is the first government of the United States. Pause and take a minute to note all these things. But what's important, and we'll get more into the Articles later, but the issue with the Articles, of course, is it was a very decentralized governmental structure designed to win this war but not become tyrannical. And so after the war, there's going to be some issues with the Articles of Confederation that are going to, of course, have to be worked out. So let's get to the War of Independence itself. The British strategy was relatively straightforward. They were going to send an overwhelming force. They were going to replace General Gates, and instead were going to give command of the war to three different generals: General Howe, General Henry Clinton, and Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne. These three generals were going to direct the war effort, and theoretically they were supposed to coordinate together, but they hated each other, and they had no interest in actually working together. And so more or less, each of the three did their own thing, and all of their orders were relayed through London. So that was a massive problem. So the British had massive military superiority, but absolutely no coordination, or very limited coordination, between these three armies. The American strategy was going to be to just outlast the British because obviously the British are a long way away from home. The Americans know the terrain. There's very little chance that the United States would actually be able to beat the British Army in a fair fight, a traditional military set piece battle. And so the goal of the Americans was to bleed the British dry and to attempt to draw out the conflict until England decided it wasn't worth it to fight any longer. The British were going to try to hold the cities and mobilize the loyalists and crush the rebellion before it spread. So let's see how this whole thing goes. Probably the most important part of the early war was the fighting around Ticonderoga, which is in upstate New York. Ticonderoga is a fort about halfway between New York City and Montreal, right in here. And so it's at this fort that one of the first and most important battles of the early revolution was fought. This was incredibly important because there was a very well-trained group of militia that had actually been fighting generally against the government of New York up to this point, but they switched sides. The Green Mountain Boys of Vermont and their commander Ethan Allen, they were able to, along with Benedict Arnold, were able to capture the fort of Ticonderoga, which was incredibly important because Ticonderoga was full of artillery. And so this artillery is going to become incredibly important in a moment. But Ticonderoga was also important because it was a staging ground. Oh, here are the guns of Ticonderoga, by the way. Or I should say replicas of the guns of Ticonderoga. But still. It was a launching point for our invasion of Canada. One of our goals was sort of to get our Canadian brothers to join in. And so we launched an ill-fated invasion of Canada, attacking the all-important city of Quebec by sending two armies there. The first army was relatively delayed, and the second army Well, First Army was relatively delayed because they took this brutal overland march. And the Second Army got there, launched their assault, and the commander, General Montgomery, who was one of our finest officers, was killed by a bullet in the neck. And the attack failed miserably. The Canadians failed to rise. The Native Americans in that area mostly sided with the British. And the end result was we failed to attack Canada. And the Quebecois, who were honestly mostly French fur traders still, had very little interest in joining together with the Puritans of New England. And so there was really no chance that Canada would rise to join us. So this attack was a failure, and it lost us one of our best commanders. But Ticonderoga did allow us to capture the city of Boston because Washington had set up in Cambridge, sort of across the bay from Boston. And they were able to speed march the cannons down from Ticonderoga. And Washington, over the span of one night, was able to set those cannons up on the hills overlooking the city. And so over on Dorchester Heights here, he was able to set up these cannons. And when the British woke up in the morning, they saw Washington with the high ground and the cannons aimed at the city. And so the British decided to withdraw rather than fight. And so Washington is able to recapture the city of Boston. But the fact that the British were able to just get in their ships and leave highlights another one of the major advantages that the British had. The British had access to a navy, which we did not. And so the British were able to basically cut off the colonists from any trade or from much trade with anyone else in Europe, and were able to move their army as freely up along the coast, and there was very little that we could do to stop them. So if they wanted to move their army, now they could attack more or less any city along the coast, which was terrifying to most areas that were very vulnerable to British attack. So Washington is able to capture the city of Boston, but the British army, not destroyed, still at large, could show up anywhere. And where they show up is New York City. New York City at this point was one of the most important cities of the colony in the colonies. Washington was able to march the army from Boston down to New York to try to reinforce the city because they were, of course, worried that the British were going to try to take it. But in an incredibly bloody battle, Washington forgets or neglects to reinforce one of his flanks. He is overwhelmed, but Washington is able to move his army out of New York City and keep them intact. And so this is probably one of Washington's greatest strengths is despite the fact that he's outmatched and is defeated repeatedly, Washington is able to keep the Continental Army together because if that army is destroyed, it's more or less game over. So Washington is really, really good at losing battles. This is highlighted, or this battle itself is highlighted in the Hamilton song "Right Hand Man." So if you're following along on Disney Plus, "Right Hand Man" is the song that talks about the Battle of New York City. And so we'll leave it off there for today. The British now control New York and are chasing Washington, who is fleeing in New Jersey. Boston has been re-liberated, but the British have 3 armies in the field, massive military superiority, and the colonists have declared independence and are starting to unify. So these are our objectives for today. Make sure you can provide a substantive answer to each of these pieces, and we'll be back next time to move both the revolution and the war forward.